Okay, so I think we'll get started. I'm Dan Rabin. Welcome to the Branford Forum. It's a lovely day, so we really appreciate everybody taking the time out from your family and from the lovely Sunday to join us for this very interesting and important topic. I'd like to thank Jenna Anthony and her colleagues at the Blackstone Library for their support over the years and for hosting this program. We will be recording the program and it will be uploaded to the Blackstone YouTube channel in the next couple of days. And I will send out a link to that so everybody can share it with your friends and colleagues and enjoy it again if you like. The next programs, the first one on November 21st is Professor Jay Rosen from NYU, and he will be talking about civic journalism, which is especially important in this time where the consumer of news is called upon to be almost an editor and to try to figure out whether the news that's being presented is true or not, or slanted, etc. And I think that's going to be especially important for topics like climate change, where there is a lot of nonsense being proliferated in news outlets. On December 19th, Charlotte Danello will be talking about opera, and we're looking forward to that session as well. In the future, we hope to do hybrid programs where people who are in Branford will be able to come to the library and enjoy the program there, and people who are removed from New Haven or from Connecticut will be able to enjoy it in a streaming format. So we're working on that, and again, Jenna is being very helpful for us. So again, we are recording this. If people have questions during or after the program, you can raise your hand in Zoom, or you can enter the questions in chat. We'll be watching that, and we'll try to answer all the questions and of course make it the program as interactive as possible. So once again, my name is Dan Rabin, and welcome to the Branford Forum. Our presenter today is Professor Narasimha Rao, who is a professor at the Yale School for the Environment, and he will be talking about climate change and a vision for the future for our energy systems. And I believe he's going to take us beyond the fretting and the doomsday scenarios and the denial to a place where we can imagine an energy future that is green and clean, and as well as a way that we as individuals can help our society get there. Professor Rao, thank you so much for joining us today, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Daniel, for inviting me. Thank you, everybody who is attending, for being here on a Sunday. This is, in my view, a really pivotal time, maybe one of the most important decades in our lifetimes, at least. And I really appreciate your interest in this topic. What I'd like to do today, as Daniel said, I will take for granted that we accept the climate crisis for what it is. I will not be talking about the climate science or justifying that we need to solve this problem. Rather, I'm going to take for granted that we have this goal that we've set globally in the Paris Agreement in 2015 to limit the temperature increase on average from pre-industrial times to well below 2 degrees C in the planet. And I'd like to do three things today. I'd like to first provide you an international context for this problem. I think it's really important that we understand it's a global problem that can only be solved with the cooperation of all countries, or most countries in the world, and give just a bit of an appreciation of that. Secondly, I'd like to talk about a vision for what I think society needs to look like in a zero carbon world, or to achieve the net zero target, as we call it. I've spent a lot of time looking at different scenarios that researchers have put together of the future. So I have a pretty good understanding of what we need to do, even though there are a vast range of options. All of them do have some commonalities. And then lastly, I'd like to end with policy here in the US and discussing specifically what the challenges are and what we as individuals can do. So yeah, I also want to say that I encourage you all to make interventions or ask questions during my talk, because particularly if you find something is not clear or seems to be dissonant with your own understanding of things, I would very much appreciate if you can to raise your hand, and I'll try and monitor the attendee window here, and I need to just set myself up to do that if you give me just a second. There we go. Now I have your list so I can see your hands being raised. Okay. So let me start by talking about the big picture. So we have this goal. We need to stabilize concentrations of carbon dioxide and limit non-CO2 greenhouse gases in the atmosphere and prevent their accumulation beyond what we have today. That's keeping them well below 450 parts per million. And this requires us to essentially become a net zero emissions society. That means we need to bring global emissions down to zero so that we don't accumulate any more of these emissions in the atmosphere. We've been on this path of increasing emissions all the way till today. So you can see that the ambition we have is quite drastic. The red band that you're seeing represent the pledges that countries have made to reduce emissions. These have been updated a little bit, and they expect to be updated even more in this upcoming international negotiations in Glasgow in COP26 in just a week or two. So we expect that these will hopefully get more ambitious, but nevertheless, we are still far away from a target of achieving well below 2 degrees C. In fact, even if all the pledges were to be achieved and enforced as envisioned, we would still probably achieve temperature increases of well above 3 degrees C. And we can't even expect that all of those pledges are going to be implemented. So we really have a lot of work to do in terms of increasing the ambition and also making enforceable some of the pledges that countries have. The trajectory we need to be on is this blue and green trajectory, the blue being 2 degrees C and 1.5 being the green trajectory. And what you'll see is that we need to rapidly decarbonize our economy, both on the demand side and supply side, as I'll talk about. But along the way, it is also possible that we will be trying to increase the amount of sequestration of carbon. So as you all probably are aware, on the planet, we currently not only emit CO2, but the natural systems of the world absorb CO2. And in order to achieve the goals that we have set ourselves, not only do we need to bring our emissions down to zero, but we need to suck some carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere so that we can stabilize them at concentrations that will allow us to achieve these targets. A lot of pledges that you know of today from companies increasingly and from states involve not necessarily reducing their emissions, but trying to offset their emissions by trying to invest in reforestation strategies or carbon sequestration strategies. But we will need both. We need to achieve net zero as rapidly as possible. January 2050 is seen as the point where we need to achieve a net zero. And after that, we will be sucking further emissions out of the atmosphere. So this is the target that we have. It's very ambitious. It includes negative emissions. That is, we're going to have to invest in technologies that are net negative in terms of their contribution. So they sequester carbon in the ground or in forests and in other forms. Now, let me just provide you a bit of an international context. The reason we are trying to address this problem is to avoid impacts of the kinds that we've been increasingly seeing in the US. Extreme events, wildfires, droughts, floods, hurricanes. But it's important to keep in mind that countries outside of the US, especially low-income countries, and especially the poor and vulnerable populations in low-income countries, are likely to bear an even bigger disproportionate burden of these climate impacts that we're trying to avoid. And it is an expectation from a lot of countries in the world that industrialized countries take the lead in trying to solve this problem. So this is not just about making sure we achieve ambitious targets, but also making sure that industrialized countries who have contributed largely to the problem today are an active component of solving this problem. And these problems involve sea level rise, heat stress, extreme events, food security that are going to potentially threaten the food supply for billions of people across the world. So the motivation for these targets has been established quite clearly by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. If we achieve less than 1.5 degrees C compared to 2 or 3 degrees C, we will have saved the lives and improved the quality of lives of billions of people across the planet. And that's really important to understand. So now, one additional important aspect of climate solutions is doing it in a fair manner. And I want to explore this just for a minute. I'm showing you here our growth in emissions only in the recent past. And this block over here represents about half the world, 3.5 billion people in affluent countries largely, including China, who have incomes in the range of $10,000 to $100,000 per capita. And we have been increasing our emissions steadily, even in the most recent past. And now we demand that we move down to net zero by 2050. But let's keep in mind that we have another 3.5 billion people in the world who have an order of magnitude lower income levels. So they have $1,000 to $10,000 per capita, who are just growing their economies, trying to build infrastructure, growing their various services and basic needs to provide for people. And now they are also being asked to transition their economies down to net zero at the same time. And you can imagine that if we find this to be an economic and political struggle in our countries, that in the rest of the world, you're really unlikely to be able to see those kinds of transformational changes at these income levels unless and until the industrialized world creates the markets for these technologies, takes the lead. Otherwise, we're not going to be able to achieve these targets. It's probably a political reality. These countries are dealing with significant development challenges that we don't have to deal with. Very basic services, having reasonable homes and cooking with stoves that are not killing women and children. There are 2 billion people who don't have food security, and so on and so forth. So it's important to understand that this is a global challenge alongside other global challenges that are equally daunting for other countries to meet. Okay, so let's look at the US, and let's just get a quick glimpse at our emissions today. I want to give you a sense for what it is we're trying to decarbonize, right? What's the challenge entail? And this gives you a sense of the proportion of our emissions from different sectors in the economy. But I want to be able to give you a feel for what this means in terms of your life. So let's take a look at the critical elements of our lives that are contributing to the greenhouse gas emissions in these various sectors. So if we look at residential and commercial sectors, this is really dominated by heating and cooling. Yeah, this is because we're in a country that has very cold winters. Probably 10% of total greenhouse gas emissions are just from heating our homes. But we also have hot summers, and the amount of air conditioning is increasing, both in office buildings during the day and residences in the evenings through summer. So this is the main component from our buildings. We have almost 18 to 20% of our emissions coming from the agricultural sector, which is very much dominated by the consumption of meat. And this is from the methane emissions from ruminant animals like cows, but it is also the feedstock that we feed these animals, driven largely by corn and soy from other countries, as well as by the land use change. So we are deforesting and growing crops across the world and importing them to feed animals that we then eat. So that's a major component of our emissions. Industry, as I'll show you, is one of the hard to decarbonize sectors. And if you think about what products depend on these emissions or lead to these emissions rather, they are largely coming from chemicals in the US, plastics. We have a fast fashion industry in the last 20 years that has taken over the world. And we throw away something like 80 kilograms of clothes per year in the US. So our consumption of clothes, general consumer goods, packaging are all contributing to our greenhouse gas emissions through their production. And then, of course, the construction of new homes and infrastructure is the other big component in industry. Electricity generation, we are familiar with all of the appliances in our homes that use electricity. Probably the fastest growing sector in this segment is electronics and gadgets. And this is also a symbol of a throwaway economy. Most of our electronics have a lifetime of just a couple of years. And so, aside from the waste problem, they are pretty energy intensive to manufacture. And finally, there's transportation, which contributes actually in CO2 terms about 40% of our CO2 emissions. But if you take into account all greenhouse gases, it's about a quarter of the economy. And here, the biggest contributors are our sports utility vehicles in terms of passenger vehicles. Air travel, aviation actually today contributes barely 1.5% of greenhouse gases, but it's a very fast growing segment. We also have to consider freight transport, so trucks and freight flights, and those also contribute a small percentage, but a very fast growing percentage of our total emissions. So this is, in a snapshot, the various activities and products and services that we rely on that are contributing the most to the US greenhouse gas emissions. And our goal is to bring the emissions associated with these services down to zero. So you can imagine that we need to decarbonize their production, but it's also possible that we may make changes in the demand side, which I'm going to talk about, so that we have less to decarbonize. And that's a very important element to remember, that the less we grow, especially waste, consumer goods that don't even provide any use to us, it's really important that we discipline that kind of growth so that we lessen the challenge of decarbonizing the economy. How are we going to get there? Well, one part of the solution that I'm sure all of you are familiar with is that we need to electrify the economy, right? I showed you over here that electricity generation today is barely 30% of the economy. So in order to decarbonize the entire economy, we do know how to decarbonize electricity generation pretty well. So the more we can convert other sectors to electricity, the more we have a problem that is a little bit tractable. So the electrification of the economy is very critical. These are different scenarios that were put together by a research group in Princeton. It's not so important that you know what these scenarios are. What I'm trying to illustrate to you is historical electricity growth, and here projected for the next few years in the absence of any climate policy. But then you have to the right of this, all of these different scenarios of climate policy, which if we rely on renewable energy, like solar and wind, was going to increase the amount of electricity we use by a factor of 2 to 5. In the middle two, if you rely on nuclear for electricity generation, perhaps we grow a little bit less. But in all cases, we're going to grow the electricity sector by more than double. And this is important to understand, that while we reduce our overall energy use by becoming more efficient, reducing wastage, the electricity component of our energy consumption is going to increase drastically, which means we have to expand our electricity system. We're going to build new transmission to source renewable energy from the oceans, from distant, the Great Plains or other regions where we have a lot of untapped potential for wind. The Central Valley in California, where we have a lot of potential for solar power, but we need to bring that energy to the load centers in the US. So we have to figure out how to expand the electricity system. We're also dealing with intermittent supply. And because we have intermittent supply, we have to deal with the fact that we need electricity even when the sun doesn't shine and the wind doesn't blow. And so we are going to use electricity to make hydrogen. We're going to use electricity and we're going to store it. We're going to store it in batteries that we can then discharge later. We can potentially store it in carbon. So we can find ways that we can sequester carbon using electricity, because the sequestration of carbon is an energy intensive activity. We are also going to substitute traditional ways of making heat with electric heat using electric boilers. And these are new applications, and so they have a significant component to the overall growth of electric demand. So we have an all-electric economy that we expect in the future, but this does not mean that that's going to solve the problem entirely. There are many sectors that are actually not going to be so straightforward to electrify or to decarbonize. I just wanted to give you a sense for that. Here are the sectors that are ordered here in terms of the extent to which they have been developed and commercialized in sort of a technology life cycle. And you can see here, the power sector is the one that's furthest along. We know how to decarbonize power. We have brought down the prices of solar and wind to make them commercial in many parts of the world. Electric vehicles are not so far behind globally, although we have a long way to go. Only less than 3% of new sales in the US are EVs, but we at least know how to make this technology. We know how to scale it up. But if you go down this curve, you'll see that many of the industries, cement, steel, plastics, think about our dependence on global supply chains that are currently being disrupted due to COVID. We rely on oil products for shipping. We rely on oil products for our airplanes. And I mentioned agriculture and land use. So we have a lot of work to do here in technology development as well. And this is why we require a significant prioritization of carbon policies so that we can support this technology development in the private sector. And it has now become amply clear that we need that support from government. And it needs to be clear to people far and wide that simply, decarbonizing electricity is an interim goal. It is not going to help us decarbonize the entire economy. One more component that people may not be thinking a lot about is land use change. That is, we are relying, besides electrification and besides R&D for technologies, we are relying on increasing the amount of carbon we sequester in forests, as well as in new technologies such as direct air capture, or carbon capture and storage under the ground. And these are all very nascent technologies. Today, we're seeing an increasing focus on nature-based solutions because that's what we know from the past. And so we need to scale up what we know because we have such an urgent crisis. So I want to give you a very quick snapshot into that land use in the world. You'll see that from all of the land that is currently on the Earth's surface, 70% of that is habitable land, of which half the land is used for agriculture, and the other half is forest and shrub. And we rely on these forests to sequester carbon today. But of that 50% of our habitable land, more than 3/4 goes to livestock. But that 3/4 of land is feeding livestock that only supplies less than 20% of our calories. So we're using 3/4 of the land available in the world to supply 20% of the calories in the world. And the remaining quarter of land is basically supplying the rest of the calories from plant-based food around the world. So when we think about increasing the amount of carbon dioxide that we're trying to sequester in the world, where is that going to come from, right? What land use change are we going to undertake in order to grow new forests? And one of the universal solutions is for us to modify our diets so that we rely less on livestock because there's such a high land intensity that with some moderation in our diets, we can significantly reduce the land we need for grazing, which opens up possibilities for intensifying plant-based agriculture as well as for reforestation. So this is a very important part of our solution as well. A question people ask is, how much is all of this going to cost? Well, we have an estimate from different studies that it's actually not that expensive if we think globally. This is about $1 trillion of investment per year, which sounds like a big number until we consider that global GDP is over $90 trillion. It's also important to understand that half of that money we already spend on energy investments. And the other half we actually spend on fossil fuels today. And so if we were to shift our investments into fossil fuels towards low carbon technologies and carbon sequestration, this is actually a fairly feasible amount of investment globally speaking. So it's important to understand that this is not something that's going to all of a sudden make, have significant economic costs. There will be pockets of the economy where we have particular transitions that are very drastic, leading to employment effects, such as, of course, the coal industry. But we need to address that problem in a different way, by retrenching workers, by providing education programs. But certainly overall, from a global perspective, this is not a drastic cost as we understand it. Okay, I'm moving slower than I wanted to go. Let me quickly go through the vision of a society I think we need to live in. One big element of it, as I mentioned, is electrification and electrification of transport. But an important element of that electrification is that we share resources so that we can build less cars in the future. And so a lot of countries are investigating car sharing programs to try and get people off of buying new cars. In cities, which is where the bulk of future growth in the world is, bicycles, also public transit. These are all modes of transport that are extremely important to increase. And in the US, about 95% of our travel is by passenger vehicles. So as we shift to electric vehicles, that's a good move. But if we do it with just maintaining our car culture today, it's going to just be a much slower process than if we were to actually change mobility so that, for example, Uber Pool becomes a major service rather than just Uber. If we start to use the Metro North and Amtrak a lot more so that people buy less cars, that will ease the problem significantly. And there are a lot of benefits associated with this. We have clean air, which saves a lot of lives from this. We have less congestion in cities. So there are many benefits to this kind of a world as well. We expect to build with new construction more efficient homes that may be using solar energy to heat water or to generate electricity, homes that have a lot of insulation, so we don't need to provide as much heat to keep them warm in winter and cool in summer. We potentially could be using heat pumps that rely on a reservoir of heat under the ground in our yards, where we have a ground source heat pump. And we have a heat exchanger that allows for that very efficient heating and cooling solutions. We can also think about moderation. So if we look at the size of new homes, the US is by far the most, builds the biggest homes compared to all industrialized countries that have very comparable affluence. So we have to think about the size of our homes in the future, because the energy that we use for all of our appliances and heating and cooling are entirely dependent on the size of our homes. So if you look at other countries in Europe with similar affluence, they have much smaller homes. So these are slightly more drastic changes that we might think about in terms of our behavior, but they can potentially deliver a lot of reductions without necessarily compromising the quality of our lives. We expect to have smart homes where we interact with the grid. We potentially charge up electric vehicles from the grid. We provide our electric vehicle as a service to the grid, as a storage device. We may sell electricity to our neighbors. We may store the electricity in batteries and completely go off the grid potentially, so that we are a smart home. Inside our homes, we could rely on information technology to have smart appliances, to run efficient appliances so that we reduce the amount of demand growth in the future. We may be able to reschedule automatically our washing machines so that they run in the evening when load is a lot lower. We may be able to coordinate the running of appliances with the generation of electricity from wind and solar. We would use our smartphones to control these different devices. We would use electric heat pumps both for heating and cooling, so that the same device would provide us with cooling in the summer and heating in the winter. And we would be living in an information age where all of our appliances may be coordinated. Even today, I have bought smart thermostats Honeywell makes for $25 in Home Depot today. And that allows me to set different timings for my heat to be on and off when I leave the home and when I come back. I make the temperature very low at night when I sleep. And all this happens automatically, even today. So we have a lot of capability to reduce our demand even today, and we have the capability to scale that up even more in the future. We will become smart consumers. Today, I'm part of a network in Connecticut where it's called a Buy Nothing group. And what we do is when we have something that we don't have any use for anymore, such as the clothes of my son, we just advertise it with photographs on the Buy Nothing group. And within a couple of days, somebody calls up and drives up and picks up those clothes, or an old lamp that I don't like anymore, or furniture. I have not had to dump any of my old stuff. People come in and find use for it. So if we have a scale up of that kind of network amongst our neighbors, we can share and increase the product life for different products that we have. Because we throw things away, not because they don't work anymore, because we don't want them anymore. So we need to reuse, recycle, buy less, increasing the life of products, and sharing with people and communicating with people. I work from home even now, even though we've moved back to in-person at Yale, because I just find it very convenient. And I've saved a lot of my commuting costs by doing so. In the future, when the electric utility makes it possible for me to learn about my electricity usage and offer me different prices for electricity based on when it's more carbon intensive or more expensive to generate electricity, I'll be able to respond and shift my load accordingly. And I might make a contract with the utility that tells them, hey, feel free to pay me when you need to reduce demand. I'm willing to sacrifice my washing machine once a week if you pay me X dollars. And the utility would take that program up, and it would all happen automatically, controlled by the utility. All of these are extremely important in order for us to discipline our demand growth and therefore reduce the challenge of decarbonization. And they all rely on digital technologies, and in some ways disruptive digital technologies. And I think this is in any case the direction we're moving, but we just need to apply our know-how towards being just a little bit more cognizant of and attentive to our energy consumption. As I mentioned, we need to think about healthier diets, and we have a very, very nice co-benefit of being healthier, of reducing cardiovascular disease. And so the more diversified our diets, the more moderation, we avoid chronic diseases and we reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Okay, the last segment I want to mention before I open up for you to ask questions, and I haven't seen any questions here. I hope it's not because I'm racing through, but let me give a pause right now, just for a second at this point, before I get into policy and policy challenges. I've been through a lot to discuss with you the global context of the problem, that we need to do more in this country because the entire world actually, in some sense, is seeing this as an obligation on the part of industrialized countries. I've said we need to decarbonize different aspects of the economy, electrify, increase land use change, increase carbon sequestration, and also on the demand side to become smart consumers. So does anybody have any question about those different aspects before I get into talking about policies a little bit?
We actually do have a question that came in from someone in Arizona, and that is, what impact could titans of Silicon Valley, such as Tim Cook, Jeff Bezos, Zuckerberg, and Elon Musk have on leading their own companies into electrification and net zero carbon in their production facilities, etc., and especially shipping? Who might be persuasive to these billionaires? And this person mentions that they actually already have time of use pricing of electricity available in Arizona.
Yeah, thank you for that question. That's a really important point. We have these software giants. They have an enormous influence on our economies today. They also have deep pockets, but they also encourage a consumer kind of economy that may actually work against us. So they hold influence and they have potential solutions as well as increased challenges. So how are we going to direct them towards the solution? So the person with the question mentioned their own emissions, and I think that that's a start. I think very often companies in their pledges for achieving net zero from the perspective of the company might be considering only their own facilities. That is, they might not be thinking about the emissions generated from the products they sell. And so that's fine, that's good. If they have solar panels and if they're electrifying their transport, their freight transport, if Amazon trucks are all electric, that's good. But we need to be cognizant of the fact that they may be doing so that is achieving net zero by trying to find ways to offset their emissions elsewhere in the world, by trying to find reforestation projects and voluntary offsets elsewhere. And I know that that may not really be sufficient for us. So we have to think about holding their feet to the fire in terms of ambitious targets for net zero. I think also, there's the Amazons of the world in particular are encouraging retail growth, right? And electronic retail has been skyrocketing at a very fast pace, and all of that involves more production, more global shipping, and so in some ways that direction of change moves against, or at least increases the challenge of decarbonization. At the same time, they have the potential to really be market leaders by investing in these technologies to decarbonize their own facilities. They are big enough that they may potentially create a market for these products to achieve enough scale that brings down the prices for everybody. But ultimately, I think it's only policy that's going to hold their feet to the fire. I do think ultimately, this is what I wanted to talk about next, is that we have to really focus on pushing through legislation at the state level and at the federal level, including all sorts of investments and regulations, in order to make sure that all sectors of the economy have the right incentives and signals to move towards decarbonization. So I don't think that these on their own are necessarily going to do it.
One of our participants added the comment that he mentioned that we are negotiating with Amazon for a distribution center in Branford, and I know our first selectman Jamie Cosgrove has pushed for that center to be as green as possible. And this contributor, this participant today, says the plan for the Amazon distribution center in Branford shows its delivery vans as electric. So I think in addition to state legislation, it's also possible for localities to actually have an impact.
Absolutely. So I think, especially with new facilities that companies are trying to site, I think we do have the institutional setup for local influence to pressure those companies to pursue certain kinds of policies. So absolutely, you can have pressure that is put on at a local level, state level, federal level, and global level as well. And it's important to try all those levels. I absolutely agree.
We have a couple more questions, but why don't we go ahead with your presentation, and we'll talk about them at the end.
Okay, fine. So I wanted to bring it down to brass tacks. Here we have in the US several states that have pledges, and these are more than pledges actually. In some cases, they are either executive orders by the state governors, or they are statutory targets set up by law to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And they generally are of two kinds. One of them, consistent with the global Paris target, is to bring emissions down to at least 80% below either 2000 levels, 2005 levels, or 1990 levels, some point in the past, bringing our emissions by 2050 to well below 80% of that. And so that's essentially trying to bring us to a net zero society by 2050 in the US. But they also include an interim target in 2030, which can take the form of a target to convert the entire electric sector to zero carbon, or it could be kind of an interim target of 40 to 50% less emissions relative to the baseline of 1990 or 2005 or 2000. Because if we don't achieve that interim target by 2030, in the next decade, we're unlikely to achieve the 2050 target. So those are the two kinds of targets that we have. And it's really important to understand that we don't have the policies in place anywhere in the US today to support those targets. We don't have them. We do not have them in place. So the Biden's infrastructure plan today, as you know, is in peril because it's resting in part on one seat in the Senate, a Manchin, and there will be a lot of dilution of the plans and targets that Biden has announced in the infrastructure bill. But of those, several hundred million that are intended to go to the clean electricity plan and to other aspects of infrastructure that will support decarbonization we expect it to be watered down. So there is a high reliance on these state initiatives and local as well to push policies in order to achieve these targets that we have set for ourselves. And it's very clear, we need to electrify our homes, we need to make heat pumps cheaper, we need to electrify electricity production, because moving to electric vehicles is today, it's going to reduce emissions to some extent, but not to a large extent, especially if you're in a coal state. So we need to decarbonize the electricity production, which means that we have a lot of renewable portfolio standard targets. About 30 states in the country have targets to decarbonize electric production and to increase the supply from renewables, such as wind and solar. So we need to enforce those. Where they are voluntary, we need to make them mandatory. We need to encourage electric vehicles, but we also need to think about trying to increase public transit to the extent possible in metropolitan areas, as well as to encourage ride-hailing services that are carpooling, so Uber Pool as opposed to Uber. Today, the ride-hailing services have actually been increasing transport emissions, not decreasing them. And so we need to understand that just by having electric Uber vehicles, we are actually not necessarily reducing our transport emissions. That's a major challenge. For industrial emissions to reduce, we need we need clear policies and guidance from government and potentially federal investments in particular technologies. So hydrogen is a very important fuel that we need to rely on for very, very high heat applications in industry. And that can really only come from passing legislation. And so there, our role as consumers is really more as a voter than as an emitter. That we need to follow the legislation in our respective states and make sure we're pressuring our senators and our local legislators to push for stringent policies in order to make sure that all of the industry have the right signals. That's all I wanted to mention. So let me stop right there and give you a chance to ask specific questions. I'm going to pull up my chat window as well so I can read your comments.
So someone asks, well, first of all, thank you so much. That was great, and I think it really stimulated a lot of interest in the questions and a call to action for all of us. Someone asked, how bad are takeout food containers?
Yeah, so we have a lot of environmental problems to deal with, and a lot of them have to do with the disposal of products, which have a lot of implications in terms of pollution, air, water pollution. They have justice implications in terms of how they affect other countries where we dump our waste. But they also have greenhouse gas implications. And people don't necessarily know how much of a GHG problem it is. So let me give you some perspective. If we think about plastics, clothes, these represent approximately 3 to 5% of global greenhouse gas emissions. Okay, just the production of plastics, just the production of our clothes, 3 to 5% of our greenhouse gas emissions. In certain countries, it could be more than that. In the US, I believe it could be up to 8% of our emissions. Now, if we think about packaging, really the bulk of packaging of our retail products in grocery stores, that's really the bulk of our problem in terms of the plastics use in retail. We do throw away about a quarter of our food in the US. 25% of our food is thrown away. So that's 25% of emissions associated with production that could easily be resolved without affecting how much food we eat. I don't mean easily in terms of supply chain. I mean in terms of our services that we receive. So if we now think about the plastic packages for takeout, right? That's a wonderful thing to do. I think it's important, but really these kinds of small behavioral changes are important in terms of our overall attitude as a symbol of what else we might be doing in our lives. But that specific action is really part of a broader portfolio of changes we need to make. Really, the food that we put into those takeout containers probably is more of the issue than the containers themselves. And if we think about reducing our food wastage, that's more important. But of course, the plastics have health effects when they go into water supply. So we do need to shift over to compostable takeout containers. We should be charging for plastic bags when we come out of the grocery store. I do think those sorts of changes are important, but let's keep clear that they don't have a very big impact on overall greenhouse gas emissions. They're just part of a consumer culture that's really important that we need to pursue.
Speaking of, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just reading through the other questions. Shall I just do that, or would you rather moderate the questions down?
Well, I have one good question here that's not in the chat, and that is when we talk about reducing emissions and the climate crisis, one thing that is frequently mentioned is other countries such as India and China and their reliance on coal and their trajectory from poverty to wealth. And as really, what should I say, and the elephant in the room, that what we can do on a day-to-day basis really pales in comparison to the challenges that are anticipated in these emerging economies overseas. Could you give us a little bit of perspective on what's going on both in India and China, and what you see in the next 20 or 30 years in terms of their development and its importance for the climate?
Yeah, so that's a very important question. And it is an important barrier that there are countries in the world that are still coal producing. And India and China are the biggest. The other ones are Poland, Germany, and the US are the other countries where coal is still a significant contributor. It's just important to put in perspective that there are a lot of challenges that we face in this problem, and I think we need to focus on our own challenges. I would say about the Indian and Chinese economy, the contribution of renewables to the growth of electric capacity in India as a percentage of total installed capacity is far greater than in the US. So solar has actually become competitive to coal in India, and there has been a surge of investments in India for grid scale solar power, to the extent that even low-income farmer communities are trying to install solar panels to operate their pump sets, because they have more control over those pump sets when they have solar panels that are supplying water when they need them. So the amount of solar capacity that is being invested in India as a percentage of overall investments far exceeds that of the US in India. That despite the fact that there's 70% of energy in India still comes from coal. But the only way that's going to change is if we start to address the entire economy. And so we need to create markets for these new technologies, such as offshore wind, such as carbon sequestration through air capture, such as next generation wind turbines that are much, much larger and more efficient than the current generation in India and China. These need to achieve a scale that makes them affordable in developing countries. And that market scale will have to happen in industrialized countries because they are just so much wealthier. We just cannot expect that you will have the next generation of solar and wind being developed in countries with 1/10 of our income levels. So it's a complex problem. I could talk endlessly about the different facets of this. There's also the political economy of the coal sector. In fact, in India right now, they're having trouble delivering coal to coal plants. And so there's many reasons why there's going to be a shift over from coal in India. Just a quick word on China. I would say China is singularly responsible for generating the cost reductions we've seen in the solar photovoltaic market, as well as the wind market, and now electric vehicles and batteries. They are the leading market consumer for these products, but also supplier. And so their role has been instrumental in commercializing low carbon technologies at the same time that they are still dependent for over half their energy on coal. So it's a very complex problem. I want to address this a good question here about updating homes. I think all of us are concerned, how can we improve our homes. I myself live in a home that I find embarrassing in terms of its size and insulation. And I've investigated trying to upgrade my home, install heat pumps. I'm not able to do any of it, because heat pumps today work with forced air systems. I have a forced water system. The payback that I'm seeing is not even affordable for me to entirely improve the shell of my home. And so I'm slowly upgrading my windows to high efficiency, and I'm waiting to try and install heat pumps at a time when the technology becomes available. So I think the first step as consumers, even for buildings, is as voters. We need to make sure that our states and our federal government introduce aggressive programs to make heat pumps and energy efficiency affordable to the average American. That's really first and foremost a priority for policy. And that's what we should be working on first, so that we can make those investments. Because if I, as an energy professor, I'm not able to make these investments, I can't expect other people to make them, right? Other questions? I think I addressed the offset question. I don't think we have enough offsets in the world. We're going to have to reduce our emissions. There just isn't enough for us to go around for us to keep emitting. We need the offsets, and we need to bring our emissions to zero, because as I said, not only do we need to bring our emissions to zero, we have to suck CO2 out of the atmosphere past 2050 so we can stay at below 2 degrees C. We won't stay at 2 degrees C if we go to net zero, but allow the existing concentrations to continue. We've already passed 1.1 degrees C. We're at over 410 parts per million, and we need to be well below that to avoid 1.5 degrees C and stabilize there.
So what are the chances that with when you put everything together, with all the efficiency, the conversion to renewables, will we be able to maintain less than 2 degrees C temperature increase within the next 50 years?
Well, I mean, there's a question, I have a sort of Jekyll and Hyde in me. I mean, I have a vision of the society, and I think it's eminently achievable within the next 30 years. I really think we've seen transitions in our modern history that indicate we are entirely capable of these transitions. I think I'd only point you to think about COVID. Think in the last 2 years, the infrastructure we have set up to manage this problem globally. It is a tremendous amount of mobilization of institutional resources, physical resources in the healthcare and in the health sector to administer vaccines to billions of people around the world in a matter of months. We've seen the solar industry in a matter of 5 to 7 years be transformed across the world. I do think it's possible. However, we are not at all currently at any tipping point that's going to get us there, not even close. And we need to be on that trajectory to say that, okay, it's just a matter of time. I can't, with a straight face, tell you that now it's just a matter of time. We have not achieved a turnaround. I know the infrastructure bill of Biden is very, very promising. It's something to me that I was very, very optimistic about, but I also expected the kinds of political barriers we were going to see. So if the infrastructure bill in its original pure form were to pass, I would say we have a good chance of achieving the targets we've set in this country in its pure form. And so that's what I think we should think of as kind of a benchmark for the ambition in this country, that if we're going to dilute that significantly, and if we don't institute state policies that are going to drastically reduce the cost of electric transport and of efficient homes, and also the production of hydrogen and batteries, it'll be difficult.
If there's any silver lining in the media coverage of all the recent natural disasters, it's that the news outlets are starting to talk about climate change and about attributing these unusual and high impact events to a changing climate. And that's something you didn't hear at all, maybe even just 2 or 3 years ago. So I think that in this, with this idea of seeing the climate as a real threat, like Pearl Harbor or COVID, something like that, at least in my opinion, we're starting to see the drums beating that will start to sway public opinion. Of course, it's not universal. There are some holdouts who still ridicule the idea of a warming planet, but there are at least hints that some people are waking up. Do you think that's a true perception, Professor Rao?
Absolutely. But I would say that this is not even so recent. I encourage those of you who are not familiar with it to look at the Yale Center for Climate Change Communications report on the 6 Americas. They regularly poll and report on public perceptions of climate change. And as of several years ago, more than about 3/4 of the country, the people not only think it's real, not only think that humans are contributing, but want to do something about it. But there's a lot, maybe 20 to 30% who not sure what they can do. But there's over 70% of Americans are on board to take action, and they have been for a few years. What we need to do is understand that the politics of this country favor a minority to have influence, a disproportionate influence. And those changes in that direction that we're seeing for other reasons, right? The change of voter suppression laws around the country are going to affect climate as well. So we need to make sure that the will of the majority of the people in the US is translated into legislative action, because I think people are on board and the crises have helped. I agree for sure. But we need to translate that into political action.
Could you say a word about carbon pricing? Mary Stevens raised that question.
Yeah. So, for the longest time, the carbon tax or carbon price has been seen as a theoretically optimal solution because it basically would have addressed the entire economy. Today, I believe for reasons of political realities, it's largely out of fashion in the sense that if we effectively have a number of countries around the world that have energy taxes that are akin to carbon prices, and in the US, probably less so. But nevertheless, an aggressive carbon tax of the kind that we would need would be so drastic that it would be politically unpalatable and not really very likely. I think what we have seen in the US in the last decades has been more decentralized action at the state level, at the local level, and the executive branch of the US to some extent through the Department of Energy, through the EPA, where federal investments and regulations are really the key to try and push us, and not so much a carbon tax.
If any of the participants today are interested in carbon pricing, I would send you to the Citizens Climate Lobby, and you can find out a lot more there. I think we have time for one or two more questions. Judy Schaffert asked, does the technology exist to suck CO2 out of the atmosphere? That gets back to the sequestration issue. And I would add, if it does not exist today, what are the prospects for the next 5 or 10 years?
Yeah, there are. We know of some solutions that are natural, and we have, for reforestation, there are a lot of technologies that have been pushed in the last decade in research that really have no basis in the real world. And slowly we're finding people are backing away from that. Yale just received a $100 million grant from Federal Express to try and develop basic research from nature-based solutions for sequestration. Algae, weatherization of rocks, forest, of course, and reforestation. But these are all in the lab stage, quote unquote. Really, the main sequestration solution we have that is scalable, available, and well understood is reforestation. And also how we conduct agriculture in a sustainable manner, because let's not forget that soil contains a third of the carbon on the land, and we need to increase that. So, the sustainable agriculture and reforestation, changes in the food supply system, those are, I think, to me, have the highest potential for carbon sequestration. We don't have the time to develop brand new technologies, get them out into the marketplace. That cycle is several decades, even in the most successful cases. That's a little bit of my personal view, but I do think that is represented more and more in the research that we need to rely on nature-based sequestration solutions.
We have one, let's take one final question, and it's it's a big one, but maybe you can say a few words. Is Eversource or Southern Connecticut Gas doing the right steps? And that has a lot of aspects to it. So if you could kind of, without demonizing our utilities, maybe you can say a few words about what they are doing.
Well, to be honest with you, I haven't really kept track of the specific measures. I mean, I know of several efforts. I know that they're preparing to electrify the economy. So I know that the utility is undertaking studies to look at its preparedness in terms of the transmission and distribution system in order to encourage the ramp up in electricity demand that we expect with electrification. So I think that's a real positive step. I do know that the utilities are introducing pricing schemes. So for example, they're including a product for vehicle to grid. So for people who own electric vehicles, to offer their car as a storage device that the grid operators can use to support renewables. That's a very progressive step because we need those kinds of mechanisms. Demand response programs, the utilities have demand response programs as well that pay people to reduce their demand. Tends to be industry. Let's not forget that really the bulk of the electricity consumption today is coming from industry and commercial buildings, right? Our consumption comes more from natural gas and oil for heating. Our appliances, of course, to some extent, but it really pales in comparison to industrial load. So I think they're making a lot of efforts on the industrial side with new pricing instruments and with grid preparedness, because that's one area where there is a coincidence of alignment of incentives, right? We need further electrification and growth of the electricity system. So the electric utility has a little bit of that alignment. The gas utility, I'm not so sure. There is direct opposition to what moving to electric heat pumps and electric cook stoves. So I'm not so sure what to say that's too positive about that. But at least we can say that the electric utilities have some alignment of incentives and have been pushing some policies that we do need for smart consumers and demand response.
Yes, I might add on the efficiency side, Energize CT has several programs both for commercial and for homeowners where you can increase the energy efficiency of the home. I would encourage, well, people who are in Branford can look for Branford Heat Smart. We have an interesting program for you. And if you're not in Branford, but in Connecticut, you can look at Energize CT. I think it's .org.
Yes.
For more information on that. So thank you so much, Professor Rao. It's been very informative and stimulating. And on behalf of the Branford Forum, we'd like to really express our appreciation for your time today. So goodbye, everyone, and we'll see you on November 21st, where we'll hear about civic journalism from Professor Jay Rosen. Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Thanks, Dan.
Michael.